Okay, so you want to own a trucking company.
It's surviving the miles nobody's paying you for. They were the ones who understood, long before their first load, that the real business of trucking isn't moving freight. The people who thrive in this industry were rarely the best drivers in the fleet. What separates the carrier still running in year 10 from the one that disappears in year 2 is whether they treated their fuel bill, someone who understands fuel surcharges, deadhead percentage, and CSA scores as fluently as they understand shifting gears. But it demands an owner who treats the business less like driving and more like managing a rolling balance sheet that happens to have wheels. Watching a truck you own cross the country, loaded with something that matters to someone. It gives you entry into an industry that physically moves the entire American economy, and there's real satisfaction in it.
So, is owning a trucking company worth it?
On the exact same trucks, driving the exact same routes, hauling the exact same tonnage.
Run that same 5-truck fleet through that reality, and your 8% margin doesn't just shrink. It can flip to a loss of tens of thousands of dollars for the year.
One truck needs an unexpected transmission rebuild costing $12,000, and it sits in the shop for 3 weeks earning nothing while the payment on it still comes due. The realistic scenario. The freight market softens the way it did in 2023.
Rates drop to $1.90 a mile. Diesel spikes 50 cents a gallon for 3 months straight, and you didn't have a fuel surcharge clause on 2 of your 5 trucks contracts.
Deadhead creeps up to 15%. Because loads are harder to find. Now let's do the math the way any serious operator would, because the 2-scenario ending is the only honest way to close this out.
The optimistic scenario. You're running a 5-truck fleet, averaging $2.40 per mile, keeping deadhead under 10%.
Diesel sits at a manageable national average. Your trucks run 2,200 miles a week each.
That's roughly $2.6 million in annual revenue across the fleet, and at a healthy 8% net margin, you clear around $208,000.
It was whether the owner treated fuel surcharges, deadhead percentage, and maintenance intervals with the same seriousness they treated the steering wheel.
And that assumes they're managing fuel, maintenance, and empty miles well.
The owner of a small fleet, 10 to 20 trucks, running efficient dispatch and negotiated fuel surcharges, might net $150,000 to $400,000 a year in owner income.
Once trucks are paid off, and the business has built real operating discipline. A solo owner-operator running one truck consistently, netting after all expenses including their own labor, might take home $50,000.
The largest carriers eventually stop simply hauling freight for brokers and start building direct relationships with shippers, cutting out the broker's cut entirely,
and capturing rates 20 to 30% higher for the exact same lane.
And one driver's bad habits can drag down the score for the whole operation, affecting insurance rates and broker relationships company-wide.
At 50 trucks or more, you need a safety and compliance department because your CSA score is now an aggregate across an entire fleet. And a maintenance schedule that's proactive rather than reactive, because a breakdown on an unscheduled truck doesn't just cost a repair bill.
At 10 to 25 trucks, you need a dedicated dispatcher, someone tracking hours of service compliance across multiple drivers simultaneously.
At 1 to 5 trucks, an owner can dispatch personally, find loads through load boards or a handful of broker relationships, and handle maintenance scheduling out of a notebook. And eventually to something that looks a lot more like logistics management than trucking at all. Unable to generate enough revenue per mile to cover payments they'd committed to 18 months earlier. Once a company survives all of that and starts adding trucks, The challenge shifts from driving to dispatching. In some cases, barely covering operating costs, let alone leaving room for profit. Then, starting in mid-2022 and running through 2023 and into 2024, the market corrected hard, driven by pandemic-era shipping demand and a shortage of available trucks. Thousands of new operators entered the industry chasing those rates, buying trucks, obtaining authority, financing equipment based on numbers that felt permanent. During 2021 and early 2022, spot market rates surged as high as $3.50 to $4 per mile in some lanes.
Freight rates move in cycles tied to the broader economy, and those cycles can swing violently.
And it has nothing to do with how well you run your trucks.
Now let's talk about the freight market itself, because this is the part that separates a good year from a catastrophic one.
Because a typical long-haul truck burns somewhere around 6 miles per gallon and covers 2,000 to 2,500 miles a week. A national average diesel price swing of even 50 cents a gallon can shift a truck's monthly profit by over $1,000. Diesel prices are the single most volatile variable in the entire business, and you don't control them. A truck that looks profitable on paper hauling loaded miles can turn unprofitable the moment you factor in the empty miles it takes to find the next one. Industry averages put deadhead around 10 to 15% of total miles driven. You pay for that fuel and that time. Nobody reimburses you for it. And here's the number that trips up almost every new operator. Deadhead miles. The empty miles you drive with no paying freight on board. Positioning yourself for the next load.
Insurance, 8 to 12%. Driver pay, if you're not driving yourself, 25 to 35% of revenue, often the single largest line item after fuel.
Maintenance and tires, 10 to 15%. And this rises sharply as the truck ages past 500,000 miles. Fuel, 20 to 25% of revenue. Truck payment or depreciation, another 15 to 20%. Your costs stack up against that rate relentlessly.
Your revenue comes from rate per mile, typically ranging from $1.80 to $3 depending on freight type, lane, and market conditions. Once you've survived the setup and you're actually hauling freight, the real education begins, because every load is its own tiny economy, and a business that needed near-perfect execution just to stay solvent, because the margin for error was never there to begin with.
Too much debt relative to margin. A cost structure that couldn't flex fast enough when freight demand shifted. The answer isn't one bad decision. It's the same forces sitting inside any trucking business at any size.
So how does a company with a century of history and a government lifeline still collapse this completely?
The government's $700 million loan was recovered only partially through the liquidation of the company's terminals and equipment.
Within weeks, Yellow ceased operations entirely, laid off roughly 30,000 employees, and filed for bankruptcy.
Customers, worried about a strike disrupting their supply chains, pulled their freight and moved it to competitors almost overnight. In July of 2023, contract negotiations with the Teamsters collapsed.
A contentious relationship with the Teamsters union over a restructuring plan, and freight volumes that never recovered enough to service its obligations.
For the next 3 years, Yellow struggled under a mountain of debt from decades of acquisitions. In 2020, Yellow received a $700 million pandemic relief loan from the U.S. government under the CARES Act. Yellow Corporation, formerly YRC Worldwide, was once one of the largest less-than-truckload carriers in North America, tracing its roots back to 1924.
Now here's a real company, a real name, and a real collapse, because nothing teaches this lesson better than watching it happen to one of the biggest names in the business.
And a single serious accident, even one where fault is disputed, can result in a settlement or judgment large enough to end a small carrier permanently. Those verdicts have pushed liability insurance premiums up industry-wide by double digits nearly every year this decade. Jury awards against trucking companies in accident lawsuits have climbed into the tens of millions of dollars, sometimes over $50 million. And then there's the risk that's quietly reshaping the entire insurance side of this industry: nuclear verdicts. And it can make brokers and shippers refuse to tender freight to you at all, because their own insurance and liability exposure depends on who they're contracting with.
A poor CSA score doesn't just risk a fine, it flags your company for increased roadside inspections.
Every carrier's safety performance is tracked through a scoring system called CSA, Compliance Safety Accountability, which monitors violations across 7 categories.
The ELD mandate, electronic logging device, became federally required in December 2017, and every minute of it must be logged electronically.
Hours of service regulations limit drivers to 11 hours of driving within a 14-hour on-duty window, followed by a mandatory 10-hour break.
Now let's talk about the regulatory landmines, because this industry is governed by rules that can end your operating authority in a single roadside inspection. Run the math. If your net margin before factoring was 6%, and you're factoring at 3%, you just gave away half your profit for the
usually 2 to 5% of the invoice value. It solves the cash flow problem, but it quietly eats into a margin that was already thin.
That gap is why so many new carriers turn to invoice factoring, selling their freight invoices to a factoring company for immediate cash at a discount.
But the freight bill you're hauling doesn't get paid for 30 to 45 days after delivery, sometimes longer if you're working with a broker who's slow to release funds. Fuel is typically 20 to 25% of your total operating cost, and you pay for it the moment you pull into the pump. It's not the truck payment. It's cash flow timing colliding with fuel costs that never wait. Here's the trap inside the trap, the one that actually kills new trucking companies faster than anything else. Simply because insurers have no data to price your actual risk. Then comes insurance, and this is where new owners feel the floor drop out.
And if your authority is brand new with zero operating history, expect to pay what the industry calls new entrant rates, sometimes double what an established carrier pays for.
Cargo insurance adds another $1,000 to $3,000 annually.
Primary liability insurance, the federally mandated minimum, runs $1 million in coverage. Before you've hauled a single load, you're looking at $60,000 on the low end for a used setup, or well over $220,000. Add a dry van trailer, another $30,000 to $45,000 new, or $10,000 to $20,000 used.
A used truck with 300 to 500,000 miles already on it runs 40 to 80,000, but comes with a maintenance clock that's already ticking louder than you think.
A brand new Class 8 sleeper truck costs somewhere between $150,000 and $200,000. Now for the number everyone underestimates before they've bought a single truck. Miss a quarterly IFTA filing, and you can lose your operating authority entirely.
And IFTA, the International Fuel Tax Agreement, requiring quarterly reporting on exactly how many miles you drove and how much fuel you burned in every single state.
You need IRP registration, the International Registration Plan, which apportions your license plate fees across every state you drive through. You need a US DOT number and motor carrier authority from the FMCSA, which takes weeks to process and requires proof of insurance before it's even granted. And that's before the paperwork. And then there's the split almost nobody explains clearly going in.
The person moving the freight physically usually earns less, proportionally, than the person moving the paperwork. The broker never touches a wrench, never buys diesel, and often nets a higher percentage margin than the carrier hauling the actual load.
And simply arraign the shipment for a fee. Asset-based carriers who own the trucks versus freight brokers who own nothing but a phone and a Rolodex.
But it demands specialized permits, tarps, chains, and drivers with real experience, which shrinks your available labor pool considerably.
Flatbed and specialized hauling, oversized loads, heavy equipment, construction materials, pays the best per mile of almost any segment, sometimes adding $50 to $100 a day in extra diesel. Often 10 to 15% more per mile, but that premium comes with fuel costs for the reefer unit itself running constantly. Refrigerated freight, or reefer, commands higher rates because of the specialized equipment and tighter delivery windows.
Because almost anyone with a truck can compete for it. Dry van, the standard box trailer hauling general freight, is the most competitive and lowest margin segment. And the ability to negotiate directly with shippers, usually netting 5 to 10% after everything. Small fleet operators, 5 to 50 trucks running under their own FMCSA authority, carry more overhead but capture the full rate, typically keep 70 to 80% of the line haul rate after the carrier's cut, but they absorb their own fuel, maintenance, and insurance out of that share.
Owner-operators, a single person driving their own truck under someone else's authority.
And picking the wrong one determines whether you survive your first year.
Before you buy anything, you need to understand there isn't one trucking business. There are several. The truck doesn't care if the market is good or bad. The diesel bill arrives either way. In a bad freight year, and freight cycles hard, that same company can post a loss on the exact same amount of freight moved. Large public carriers with scale, technology, and negotiating leverage might hit 8 to 10% in a good freight year. A well-run trucking company might operate at a net margin of 3 to 8%. Trucking is not a high-margin industry. It's a volume industry with margins so thin that a single bad month can wipe out a year of profit.
Here's the part that surprises almost everyone stepping into this business.
Which is exactly why margins stay thin no matter how much freight is moving. Which is basically the last mile of everything. Retail, manufacturing, construction, agriculture, all of it depends on trucks covering the gap that rail and ships can't reach. Nearly every physical object you own moved on a truck at some point, often more than once.
Massive volume, brutal margins, and a business model that punishes you the moment you stop paying attention to the numbers behind the wheel.
That's the entire story of this business in one sentence.
A company that big, moving that much freight, in an industry that large, still went to zero.
The single biggest one, Yellow Corporation, a business with 99 years of history employing over 30,000 people, collapsed into bankruptcy that same year.
And yet, in 2023 alone, more trucking companies shut down than at almost any point in the industry's history.
The trucking industry moves over 70% of all freight tonnage in the United States and generates more than $900 billion in annual revenue. Buy a truck, hire a male East Asian driver, or drive it yourself. Sign up with a few brokers and watch the freight checks roll in every week.
Stop right there. Before you continue, please be aware of the risks involved.